The Mindset Advantage, a podcast by Arcadia Consulting, architects of change.
Welcome back to the Mindset Advantage podcast. My name is Miranda Rupp from Arcadia Consulting, and today I'm joined with my colleague, Andy Patterson. Andy, thanks so much for joining me today. Please, could you give the listeners a small introduction about yourself?
Oh, hi, Miranda. Yeah, my name's Andy Patterson, as you said. I'm an Arcadia partner. I specialize in the research side for Arcadia, particularly around the areas of neuroscience and anthropology and how that affects human behavior.
Amazing. So this is part 2 of our neuroscience episodes, where we've been delving into the neuroscience behind change. The purpose of this episode today is to hopefully excite you about the brain, show you the importance of understanding your own brain and why helping others matters. So last time you were joined by our colleague Dan and heard about neuroscience, the implicit memory and the explicit memory, and how it affects our response to change. But today I really wanted to just focus in on the neuroscience of relationships, people, and teams, specifically the relationships between leaders and team members. So before we get going, for the listeners joining the podcast series at this point, Andy, could you briefly explain neuroscience and the 2 memory systems?
Yeah, sure. The behaviors of our behavior is essentially controlled by 2 memory systems in the brain. So the best way to look at this is look at the functions inside those memory systems. So if we start with the explicit system is the timeline memory that we have. So it remembers all sorts of pictures, visuals of our history, all sorts of facts and rules and logic. And it's the system that we use, that we're very aware of, constituting our memory systems. But about 35 years ago, it was discovered from somebody who was profoundly amnesiac that they could also remember things. And so we discovered that we had a memory system which we call the implicit system, which is actually much more powerful than the explicit system and controls an awful lot more of our behavior. And that covers the whole complex patterns side of our behavior. So it controls movement patterns, like when we ride a bike or drive a car or walk or run. It controls all the muscles when we're talking. And it controls our social and emotional demeanor. So all of that is going on. And the difference between the 2 systems is the explicit system is single tasking. It's very effortful. It uses lots of energy. The implicit system is massively multitasking, can be packed together. All sorts of different functions can be linked. Both of them are goal-driven, so they're both driven by the conscious part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. But those 2 systems are very, very separate, and they have separate learning mechanisms. So one is very slow to learn. It takes on experiments, it's been shown that it takes 66 times to take 95% of people to remember properly on the implicit system. Whereas the explicit system works the other way. It remembers the first time, and after that, it tends to forget things. So one is working from, if you like, perfection to forgetfulness, and the other one is slowly building in capability. And our prefrontal cortex, when it decides to do something, will issue an instruction to one of those 2 systems in order to execute the task. So if it was running across a field, it would engage the implicit system. If it was trying to remember a picture of somebody's face, it would engage the explicit system. That's a brief summary of what we talked about in the previous episode.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So with the 2 systems, I just wanted to ask how you think that these 2 systems show up between people. So this could be 2 partners in a romantic relationship, a leader and a colleague, a vendor and a client, I know I find personally that when I'm meeting someone for the first time, I have to put a lot more effort in. It's a lot more tiring than perhaps if I was having a conversation with you, Andy. And obviously we've known each other for 2 years, so it's a lot more easy, and it's more effortless. So yeah, how does this show up between two people?
Okay, so when we have a relationship with somebody, essentially that relationship is an implicit memory that's been built over time. So it starts off, as you said, with nothing. So you don't know anything about the other person, and that means to say that your implicit system has nothing to offer in its kind of automatic priming function. So you have to use all your explicit systems in order to get to understand more about that person. So what happens is essentially gathering at the first level of complexity, just gathering simple facts, and we might call it small talk. But these will be things about, well, who do you know that I know? What do you do for a living? What do you think of the weather? These kinds of things are not very insightful about the person. You can't say it's formed a deep relationship, but at one level of complexity, it's told you something about the people. Then there's a set of more complex things that starts to form part of this memory, this relationship. As you learn more about the person, about what they do, you'll gradually understand how outgoing they are, whether they're introverted or extroverted, if they're quiet, what kinds of things they find funny. And this builds another level of complexity where you start to understand the kind of social demeanor, the social preferences of the other person. And each one of these registers is providing a different dimension in the implicit system. And these dimensions are used in decision making, or in predicting what's going to happen next. The implicit system is always trying to give you a heads up on what's going to happen next, in particular, how this other person is going to behave, what they might say, what they might find funny. And so we often gradually build the level of knowledge and the level of complexity of our knowledge. We call this levels of intentionality, or sometimes dimensions. But as they get more and more sophisticated, we're trying to improve our ability to predict what that person will do next. And ultimately, we will see them behave in difficult, possibly ethical situations, which give us a real sense of their true values. And when we get to that level with somebody, we would say that we really have a relationship. We understand how that person, what that person stands for, what kinds of decisions they make in a difficult situation, and the level of our knowledge and the depth of our knowledge about that person in different ways has given us a confidence and an automaticity to our behavior, which means that we can relax with that person. It's easier, it's more comfortable to be with that person, and you feel like you're in control of events because you're with somebody else and you understand what they might do next. So the way that extends itself to teams and other people is it's really the same sort of thing, except with more people. And now you have the added dimension of how the other people in the team interact. So one of the dimensions is how somebody else in the team is going to react to what somebody else in the team said. So if you think about that, then the number of interactions and the number of predictions that you're having to make goes up very, very fast with the increasing numbers of people. And it's been proven that, we can hold a sense of deep relationship with about 5 people. And then a relationship at a lower level of intensity, but still focused on, if you like, teamwork with about 15 people, and a much lower level of, if you like, relationship or understanding with about 50 people. And the maximum number of people that we can hold a trusting relationship with is 150 people, which is typically the size of a hunter-gatherer tribe of human evolution. And until about 10,000 years ago, when the rule of law came in and religion came in, there were no societies bigger than about 200 people, because it was simply impossible to keep a level of trust absent some other way of imposing restrictions on people's behavior, which is obviously what happened when law and religion became endemic after the agrarian revolution, and the people became trustworthy of others simply because they knew that there were laws that prevented them from causing them harm.
It's interesting what you say there about levels. And just on that, I'd really like to put forward some scenarios for you of different relationship strengths. So we can just talk through each kind of level or strength and give different examples where this would show up differently. It's possible that all of the scenarios that I'm about to give are demanding or leading change, but it'd be interesting to get your advice for each one. So scenario 1, where there is no existing relationship. What advice would you give to leaders to help them to build that implicit memory and build the dimensionality that you mentioned within that relationship with their team?
Yeah, so if we go back to our model, when there's no relationship, you still have the explicit system at your disposal. So when change occurs, one of the things that happens is that our model for behaving is taken away because there's change. So I'll use the example of starting a new job. So I leave my old job, I understand the people, I understand the rules, I understand where the coffee machine is, I understand how to get things from the stores, where the copier machine is, I know the people, how they'll react, I know how to get things done. I start work day one at a new place. I don't know where anything is. I don't know any of the people. And my implicit system, the mode in which I operate, has completely been taken away. And so a serious change, like when COVID hit, effectively renders us into a position where all we have is our explicit system. And leaders need to sort of go back to basics when they don't have a relationship with people. They need to go back to basics. And that goes back to, if you like, the forming of relationships. So in a sense, it's a bit like small talk. So what you do is you express intentions at the very basic level, like leadership care. We would talk about the fact that you will represent that your intentionality is that you will care for people. And that's a logical kind of picture to be painting to people. And it helps them with an emotional state where they've had all their certainty, all their automaticity removed. So when there's no relationship, you also have to allow people to start forming their own implicit memories of the new system. And that's going to take time. So when I talked about it taking 66 times to do some of these things, if that was once a day, then that's going to be a couple of months. So people are going to have to live with uncertainty for a period of time. And that's why leaders in that position need to emphasize people looking after themselves, the concept of well-being, and the concept of coping. And we talk about resilience in several different ways, but at least part of resilience is the expectation that things will take a while to get better, which we call coping, and also a sense of focus. So try to focus on things and tasks, because all of these things can be done and can reduce the anxiety and also help grow implicit memories of the new changed environment. Once these new implicit memories are starting to build, then you can accelerate the learning process once you've gone through the coping phase by expressing the the sense of learning and intensifying the motivational process around learning, because implicit memories will be built from all of the events that are happening, whether it was learning to turn up for work on a Zoom call, or just the simple business of working from home. So those things will take time to get used to, and there will be a lot of learning going on, and trying to get people to associate the desire for learning, what we might call growth mindset, is a very effective way of doing that. And at this point in time, a relationship has been built, and therefore we can follow on the more normal course of change, and leaders will have built enough of a rapport to take that forward.
Thanks, Andy. So that leads me to scenario 2. Say you did have a relationship and it'd been built up over time, but that relationship was poor. So what advice would you give to that leader in actually defining that relationship and actually making that relationship better? But there is a relationship in place.
Yeah, and again, I can relate to this. So the implicit memory that's causing the relationship to be poor is just that. It's just an implicit memory. So in a sense, that the approach here is quite similar to when there's no relationship at all, because appealing to the explicit system will effectively bypass a lot of the aspects and emotions associated with the poor relationship. So it's still possible to operate with somebody on a logical basis, even if you have a poor relationship with them. So if I can try and explain that, if you were learning a subject at school and you didn't have a good relationship with your maths teacher, it's still perfectly possible for that teacher to teach you maths. And the same would be true if it was Latin or some highly grammatically correct kind of environment, or most sciences. But if you were studying a subject like English literature, it's very, very difficult to sustain that kind of thing with a poor relationship. So the message is, even if your relationship with people is poor, if you concentrate on the factual side of the situation and what to do, it's still going to build a successful and workable interaction with the people. And very few people, when they're working more closely together, don't improve their relationship. It's poor relationships tend to be supported by exclusion and lack of communication. So something happens, you don't like something that somebody said, you tend to avoid them, and that perpetuates the relationship. So what's key is to start rebuilding that relationship with interactions, and to make those interactions more explicit rather than implicit. And then with an improving relationship, we should be able to get to a point where the relationship's improved enough to get to the concept of growth mindset and improving the team performance as a whole.
Thanks, Andy. And that brings me to my final scenario, which is the third one. Is there any advice you can give in a scenario where there is a strong relationship and high trust?
Yeah, I think I think the strength in the relationship can obviously never be a weakness, but remember that the strength of the relationship itself will also suffer from the changed circumstances. So when you have a strong relationship, there's kind of a sense that you're in it together, and that you're suffering the same impact as, if you like, your employees or the people that you're leading. So one piece of advice is to try and step out of that and actually try to differentiate the current environment as much as possible. In other words, declare the differences that you're feeling, with the new situation that's out there, because that will help other people through your relationship adjust to the fact that things are happening. So strong relationships tend to foster a kind of a sense of continuity with the current environment. And of course, that's not always good for change. So you actually have to intercept your own sense of comradeship with your people and actually be declarative about the changes that have occurred. Make sure people are really aware that this isn't business as usual. We're not just carrying on as normal. Things have changed and that you must change your behavior. So this is a bit of a wake-up call to sort of not be too comfortable and necessarily using your relationship, but try to use, again, logic to try and kick off a new type of relationship based on learning in the new environment, and to try and reset everybody's model to become much more focused on growth mindset. And when that's been rebuilt, strong relationships are really, really good at driving for extra performance. So when you're starting to adjust to the new environment, use all the strength in that relationship to push people to set new performance benchmarks and to set your sights much higher, because there is a tendency, as I said before, for good relationships to result in some form of complacency. And in order to drive the maximum out of the team, sometimes you've got to be aware that sense of complacency takes over. So what you need to do in all of these situations is try to react in a way that flexes through time as the change impacts, because you've got a learning system that takes time in order to get through the changes. It's necessary to be resilient during that period. And you need to encourage people to be adopting a growth mindset in order to climb up to a new position of confidence and competence in the new environment. And the different states of your relationship should all be manageable in order to achieve that. But you will need to think carefully about the course of change as it happens and the different phases between them.
Definitely. And you've raised such a good point there about complacency. And that's kind of why I wanted to raise that as a scenario, because I don't want people thinking that kind of you build up scenario one, you build up scenario two from a non-existing relationship to a really good relationship, and perhaps you don't actually have to do anything. So super insightful. Thank you, Andy. I did really just want to ask, in terms of timeframes, how quickly do you think it takes to switch between the three scenarios? So if you have no relationship, how long do you think it takes to build one? I know you mentioned the 66 times, so that will play into it. But similarly, if you have a strong relationship, would you say it's easy to go back to scenario one?
It's not easy to go back to scenario one when you have a strong relationship. Implicit memories triggered by the presence of people. So you can't help but behave towards somebody that takes account of your memories of them and the way that they interact. So to some extent, it's true that as long as you've built a strong relationship with somebody, even if you met them 20 years later, you would very, very quickly find yourself back in the old relationship, literally within minutes, maybe sometimes even seconds. And it would really probably be quite shocking to you because that triggering is automatic. It's not something that your explicit system is expecting. If you haven't seen somebody for a long time, or something's happened to change your life in that period of time, often you think that you're not going to know those people anymore. It tends not to be true, and the science of the neuroscience of it would say that those memories will continue to exist. It's a little bit like when you say you never forget how to ride a bike. Well, you never really forget old friends either. And the same is true of old teams. So even the interactions that are much more complicated between the different interactions between other people and yourself, they're also going to come back quite strongly.
Amazing. Thanks, Andy. That's super interesting. I know you mentioned a couple of examples in there, and you've mentioned a couple of examples throughout the 3 scenarios, one being starting a new day at school or the maths teacher. Do you have any other examples of the above scenarios?
Yeah, well, one example would be what our own business went through when COVID arrived. We had a business which was fundamentally based around face-to-face facilitation of workshops and working with clients directly, and we had to move to a virtual environment. So the business was faced with a lot of uncertainty. Would clients still buy that? Could we deliver the kinds of programs that we've been delivering? All the skills of the facilitators were under question. Could they manage these new environments? So huge amounts of uncertainty on all kinds of fronts, far too much to sort of think your way through. But one of the things that we did was start to act as a community and to try and build relationships as we were working on these problems. So we created randomly groups of people who would get together on calls and talk about their feelings, so that they could, if you like, engage in the small talk of the new environment, so that there was a field in which we would move away from the normal business jargon. One of the things that defines existing teams and implicit memories in working groups is the jargon that they use. So the jargon that they use tends to limit the discussion to a kind of a shortcut set of language that people use. And when situations change, you really want to throw all that away because you're trying to get to a completely new model. So engaging in different and random groups in what we call huddles was necessary in order to discuss and describe and share all of the kind of learning processes around the new environments that we found, whether they were how you get shopping done or how you were feeling, or any aspect of using the new virtual technology. People could talk about it freely, and that was a very cathartic kind of process in order to sort of start us on a change process back at square one, as it were. And also, the focus that we had on well-being, looking after people, checking in with people, allowing them to talk about feelings. We arranged for one-on-one discussions on a walk. We called them walkathons, so that people could talk through their feelings one-on-one. That worked for some people. We had fun times. We had quizzes. We had cook-alongs. And so we engaged a lot of social interaction around the new environment. And by working together, if you like, with a heightened focus on social interaction, we were able to sustain the mood of optimism through the change. And indeed, as it finally turned out, make a lot of the changes that we needed to with very good effect and very quickly. And we look back on those times as formative in the new learning process, in learning how to do our job in a completely different way. And of course, it was necessary at that time to look at the problem as it was a clean sheet of paper. And all of those techniques are looked back fondly by the members that undertook them as a time of real resilience and coping with change.
I mean, it has been a pretty amazing year, both in the sense that it was obviously challenging, but we have had an amazing time together as a team. And it's easy to forget that we have all been completely virtual. And throughout this time, we've had new joiners. Some of our team members have actually never met. So we've really seen kind of all of the scenarios all the way through from scenario 1 to 3, and building up that trusting relationship. Because you forget that you've never met them in person, but you have that amazing relationship and connection with them just through all of the activities and the year that we've been through. So yeah, it's been amazing. And thank you for using that as an example. It was lovely. So just to summarize, and add to this if I miss anything out, I'm just going to go through the 3 scenarios again. If there is no existing relationship and no trust between a leader and their team member, they need to build back that intentionality, show reliability, responsiveness, to build that implicit memory, being frequent and consistent and actually personally connecting with their team member, and ensuring that the actual team member is focused on their own well-being, which is our second mindset advantage. Secondly, if there is a poor relationship between the leader and the team member, and there is a demand for change, so you don't just want to sustain what you've currently got, you'll need to refocus on building back that trust, which would require over-indexing on leadership care, well-being, and growth mindset. And then finally, if you are a leader with a strong relationship with your team member, don't get complacent. Leaders still need to care, they still need to enable wellness, and they still need to drive resilience that can accelerate the growth mindset and drive the future peak performance agenda. So that's my summary of the 3 scenarios. But if you want to add anything, please go ahead.
Oh, I think that's a very good summary, Miranda. I think the only thing I'd add is that once you have strong relationships, you should be using it to really push the envelope as far as you can in order to drive team performance and as you said, not be complacent. So that's the only thing I'd add.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Andy.
Been a pleasure.
And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, please check out our other episodes and subscribe. And if you want a deeper dive into the research that we've referenced in this podcast, please check out our website, arcadiaconsulting.com.
You've been listening to The Mindset Advantage. Follow Arcadia Consulting on social media platforms to stay updated.